Today's episode is brought to you by Alexandra Park BJJ. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a full contact martial art and combat sport that was developed in Brazil in the 20th century. With roots in Judo and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, has been developed and refined into a unique grappling art with the aim to allow a smaller and weaker individual to beat a bigger and stronger opponent with the application of proper technique. Based in Muswell Hill, North London, Alexandra Park BJJ's classes are designed so that you can develop your fitness levels, balance, coordination and flexibility in a no-pressure environment, and to provide the opportunity to start a new sport at a reasonable price. At Alexandra Park BJJ, we aim to be inclusive so that everyone can benefit from this incredible art, not just the athletic or ultra-competitive. To book your free class, head over to alexandraparkbjj.co.uk or email inquiries at alexandraparkbjj.co.uk.
Welcome to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast looking at audiobooks both big and small, as well as radio plays, narrative podcasts, anything audiobook-ish. This podcast may contain spoilers, rants, curse words, mispronunciations of names and places, and more.
Hello everyone, you're listening to Audiobookish. My name is Fahed Rahman and I'm joined by Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And this episode is our last in our series of our look at the books on the shortlist for Book of the Year, Audiobook Non-Fiction for the British Book Awards. And the two titles that we are going to be discussing are A Pocketful of Happiness by Richard E. Grant and Friends, Lovers and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry. And we're going to start the discussion with Matthew Perry's book, Friends, Lovers and the Big Terrible Thing. Do you want to read out the blurb for that, Poppy?
Yes, so. The beloved star of Friends takes us behind the scenes of the hit sitcom and his struggles with addiction in this candid, funny and revelatory memoir that delivers a powerful message of hope and persistence. In an extraordinary story that only he could tell, Matthew Perry takes readers onto the soundstage of the most successful sitcom of all time, while opening up about his private struggles with addiction. Candid, self-aware, and told with his trademark humour, Perry vividly details his lifelong battle with the disease and what fueled it, despite seemingly having it all. Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing is an unforgettable memoir that shares the most intimate details of the love Perry lost, his darkest days, and his greatest friends. Unflinchingly honest, moving and hilarious, this is the book fans have been waiting for.
Great. So one of the things I think is probably worth mentioning is that this and Edward Enninful's bio, A Visible Man, are both also on the shortlist for Book of the Year non-fiction narrative, which I think is kind of quite interesting to see that there's a crossover there. So do you want to kind of start off the discussions? Because I only just finished listening to this today and I'm still trying to figure out my thoughts about it. So kind of, do you want to kind of start off with kind of your first observations?
Sure, I can do, yeah. I think one thing that's good to note, sort of piggybacking a bit off the discussion we had about 10 Steps to the Net and the accuracy of the title. You know, sometimes you feel like, oh, the title, are they just mentioning the thing the person's famous for because that's what will pull you into it or whatever. I really think this title is very honest. It's about friends, it's about lovers, and it's about the big terrible thing, addiction. And I think, yeah, it weaves really nicely those three things. It talks about friends, both obviously his friends in that sense of, you know, friends and family friends, but also definitely a lot about the show. It talks about his lovers. It's quite a big prominent thing, is his relationship with women, specific relationships in his life, as well as just his general approach to relationships and successes and failures in general that he's had in his love life, and a lot of that tied to addiction. And then yes, addiction is a big thing throughout it, how he's found the disease, the relapses, the things that have helped him, the way he's using his experience to help others, and of course kind of a big thing that this memoir does kind of open with, or at least very much centres around and comes back to, was a very big health scare that put him in a coma, and that was because of the years of drug abuse that caused that. So yes, I think it's an interesting book that really does deliver on that. It's about these three things, and I think it weaves them together really nicely. What did you think about it overall?
So I think I kind of had one feeling while I was listening to it, and then I had another feeling after I finished it. And while I was listening to it, I quite enjoyed the way Perry tells his life story. He writes really well.
Yeah.
He's a really good writer. He's quite funny in the way he delivers his anecdotes, kind of these sarcastic, kind of pithy asides. And I was kind of like, oh, this is kind of quite enjoyable. But then at the end, my feeling was like, that was a fun ride, but I'm not entirely sure that the end of the journey itself was it didn't kind of sit in a comfortable place. So I think it's worth mentioning, you just bringing back the point that you mentioned, is kind of the book starts and ends with his stay in hospital and how that's affected him. And I think it kind of serves as a jumping off point to kind of show us, he's ended up in hospital really, really poorly, like really seriously unwell. And then kind of that jumps back as well. How did I get to this point? And then we kind of end back in the hospital. So kind of, how do I explain this? With a lot of endings, you'd kind of want it to kind of end either in like a triumphant place or like a tragic place. And this kind of ends somewhere in between.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It
because
does.
his story still be lots to left to be told, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm glad it didn't end in a tragic place instead. I'd rather it be in the middle. But yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's because it is continuing. And so he's sort of talking about it in that certainly when he was writing it, I don't know about recording, but when he was writing it, he was still, awaiting a few surgeries off the back of what had happened. And so, yeah, he very much still, at least at the time of writing, is in that place. And I can understand what you mean about kind of like narratively it therefore doesn't give necessarily a satisfying end. But I quite liked that it very much is exactly what you say. It's letting you know his story's still going on, He's still pushing through the medical struggles, he's still working through his sobriety, and he's very much wanting to make a difference for other people with his experience. And, I'd much rather he put the book out now to reach people than wait until it had a nicer ending to reach them then. So I think that's fair. And on the writing, as you were saying, I agreed. I thought it was really good. And there were definitely points where I was, actively smirking and having a snigger at stuff like that I thought was really good. My criticism on the writing would be I did think there was quite a bit of repetition. And maybe this is more on the editing side than it is actually on his writing, but there were a few bits that did repeat. I mean, I like how this book isn't chronological, we do move through time, and I think that's handled quite well, but it does mean that a few things came up a couple of times, and even a few things where it was like, and at this moment I realised this, and it's like, yes, but you did realise that a few chapters ago, and stuff like that. There was some definite repetition going on that, I would have liked a bit more, mainly, a bit more on the editing stage of working out, okay, which of the repeats of this should we keep in, and keeping it there. But that's my only criticism on the writing. The actual, like you said, the journey of the book, even if the ending isn't what you wanted, I really enjoyed the ride. I thought it was an entertaining book throughout. Yeah,
I mean, we've listened to quite a few audiobooks this year, and I think just in terms of the way, like his sentences, the way he writes, I think they're maybe some of the best sentences that I've listened to.
It's good,
this year. I mean, he really knows how to write. I was really quite impressed because you think, it's a celebrity memoir. Is it going to be a bit of a tough? But it kind of just on the quality, the craftsmanship that he kind of puts into the writing. I think it deserves to be there on those merits alone, and it doesn't surprise me that it's popped up on the other shortlist as well. So I've got just a few key words or key things kind of written down that I took notice of just while I was listening to this. So Matthew Perry's kind of explanation for addiction, he says it's kind of like there's, some people can kind of drink like a lot and then they can just stop, but he can't do that. That's not kind of within the chemical makeup of his body. But he also says that there's a part of addiction that's down to an emotional wound as well. And I thought it's kind of quite interesting how he went through the kind of circumstances of his birth, kind of his, the way his parents met and then their subsequent separation, and then how his mother was really young when she had him, and the kind of medical practices at the time of giving like babies, kind of like, I can't remember the name of the drug off the top of my head, but kind of giving them quite powerful.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, that's probably had an effect as well. And he kind of makes that observation himself, but he doesn't really put his blame on his mother or the medical establishment, because it's kind of like that was kind of this done sort of thing at the time. Was there anything about that, kind of like those, the early part of his story where he's talking about, the medical treatment that he received as a baby, then kind of like that emotional wound of like his father leaving and then not necessarily getting the attention from his mother, that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar things did stand out. It was a really interesting section and something that I didn't know anything about. I know Matthew Perry, but only through his characters. I don't know anything about him personally. And obviously was aware that he had struggled with addiction, but kind of that was all I was aware of, just that it was something that he went through, and was going through, something that affected him. But yeah, I thought it was interesting there, kind of looking at, what might some of the causes be. And there's sort of these different camps. So there's that one specific example of, he was struggling to sleep and a loud baby or an unsettled baby, and so they prescribed him a strong medication, and that very probably did have an effect on him and his relationship with drugs and his relationship with sleep throughout his life. So there's that in there, definitely. And also just this idea of some people are predisposed to addiction, and we don't really know what the causes is, but kind of no matter what would happen, he would have had this addictive behaviour anyway. And then also, that third point of, he's very much puts it down to kind of abandonment, feeling abandoned, feeling that his dad abandoned him and his mum when he was young, and then that his mum, in a sense, kind of abandoned him through her focusing on work, which supporting him without a partner was something that, he acknowledges she needed to be working a lot to be able to do that, but it meant that she wasn't around as much for me and didn't speak as much with me. And then also, when he did then kind of have a bit more of a relationship with his dad, it was between Canada and Los Angeles. And there was a big journey, and he makes a big point of how abandoned he felt as an unaccompanied minor on the plane, on the journey between those two places. And that really had a big psychological impression on him going through. And it's interesting kind of peeling back. He doesn't necessarily say, and so this is the one reason why I'm but it was really interesting him kind of exploring, okay, this is a truth about me. I struggle with addiction. Here are some of the things that probably contributed to that. And it's kind of a who knows what to pin it down to, but it was interesting to see about that kind of thing. And I thought also, just in comparing it to the ones we've been doing about recently, interesting that we just listened to Parenting Hell, and not meaning this in any way of scaring parents or anything like that, but it was an interesting look at kind of how what you do as a parent does impact your child. And one that really stood out to me, actually, as an example, was when, how when he stayed with his dad for quite a while, every day his dad would make a drink and say, this is the best part of my day. And, that was another factor that he thought kind of, okay, so I've associated that the drink is the best part of your day, and that is what makes you happy, and it kind of seems trivial to say, but your kids do pick up on this kind of thing. And as I said, not meaning that's a scare tactic or calling anyone bad parents in any way, but it's an interesting thing to consider. And obviously, yes, the not giving your baby strong medication is hopefully not going to be a problem anyway, but I think we could all easily fall into the trap of saying stuff around children that our adult brains understand the complexities around, but they won't. They might make a one-to-one connection with, this is good, and that could keep going throughout their life and could have impacts further on. But yes, as you said, doesn't blame his parents for any of this, but just acknowledges all the complexities.
Yeah, you mentioned the phrase unaccompanied minor. He kind of mentioned that's a phrase that's repeated throughout the book, and he also mentions that was a title that he had in mind for the autobiography. And another phrase that he uses over and over again is this idea of being enough.
Yeah.
Kind of, I am enough, or like the counterpoint is that he felt that he wasn't enough, and that kind of, that emotional wound stemming from his father kind of like, leaving them at the border of Canada, and then kind of his mother's like career not being able to get the attention of those two people. But again, he just said, this is what's happened to me. And I think that's probably had a contribution to the kind of the way that I approach relationships, and has
definitely
contributed to my my problem with alcohol and narcotic substances. But I'm not blaming them. I'm not blaming them. That's, you know, it's just something that happened. He also kind of mentioned like, you know, his mum was really young, and you know his dad was in a weird place with his career and stuff like that, and they just weren't well suited to each other. And it's kind of that's the other thing I felt was kind of quite interesting, was his ability to kind of acknowledge things but not necessarily. I think it showed quite a lot of character not to kind of like blame people. Yeah,
and in kind of connection with that, so he's talking about the separation, and I always find it interesting when I listen to or watch or encounter whatever stories like this, of because it's a trope in a sense, certainly if you're thinking about fiction, that comes up quite a lot, of like the kid wanting to get the parents back together. And so my parents are separated, but I never wanted them to get back together. So I always find it quite funny, or kind of it's a weird one for me to be in, because I can't really I can identify with the separated parents part, but I can never identify with that feeling that their separation was a bad thing or shouldn't have happened, and wanting them to get back together. So yeah, but it was quite nice that he, you know, later in life, A, kind of as he matured, B, also when both his parents found partners that really were good fits for them, it was really nice to see that he can acknowledge, yeah, okay, that wasn't right. It wasn't right for them to be together, and kind of came to terms with that. The other thing I wanted to say on what you've just been saying is, yeah, the impact on his relationships. So as we say, friends, lovers, and the big terrible thing. So we've talked about how that kind of childhood family stuff impacted on his addiction, but also so much on his relationships. And the main thing that stood out for me for his relationships, aside from, and just a slight warning of, you know, his feelings towards women are not necessarily the most equality-based thoughts. Just putting that out there, you know. But apart from that, the thing that stood out most when he was discussing his relationships with women was this thing of, he was so scared it would end, he ended it first. And it's just such a shame. And, you know, how many relationships have broken down because someone's been so scared of it ending that they've ended it, so scared of it ending that they've self-sabotaged, so scared that someone's cheating on them that they push them away to the point where they cheated. You know, all these kinds of stories that's just, like, I can understand the fear, but it's really, I think, for relationships, you want to be in the moment. You know, you've got to be enjoying it. You've got to not be thinking about, but what if it ends? You've got to be thinking about, but how happy am I now, kind of thing. And that was really, really sad. And kind of sad that even when we got to the end of the book, yes, he's acknowledging that he does this, but we don't necessarily have proof that he's going to break that pattern. You know, and I really hope that he would. But yeah, I think that was really sad.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting you hit on that point. I think one of the themes that does run through the biography is his inability to kind of break these patterns, whether it's to do with the way that he treats women or the way that he treats drugs as well, kind of his inability to break those patterns. So I think it's probably worth talking about the section where he kind of gets into friends. And one of the things that I found kind of quite interesting, kind of really fascinating, was he had this group of friends, actors that he hung around with, and this friend script was going around, and he was attached to another TV show, and he was giving help to these other people, kind of like who were auditioning for the show, including one of his close mates. I can't remember the name of the man off the top of my head, and everyone was saying, kind of everyone, you know, around him was saying, well, you would be perfect for this role, but he was attached to this other TV show at the time. So he was kind of like, that really kind of hurt him, because he knew he'd be able to do a good job for the Chandler Bing role. And I found it hilarious and kind of sad. And kind of like that, it is a really crossroads bit where his friend decides not to take the role of Chandler Bing and instead kind of like takes the lead on another TV sitcom, and that kind of opens up the door for him. So how did you feel about that entire section where he's kind of like trying to get into that role, and kind of the early days of him trying to be ready and stuff like that?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I found it really fascinating. And I found it fascinating in general, kind of finding out how similar he was to Chandler, or is to Chandler. And even just from the pilot script, all his friends knew that he was, and that's why they were coming to him. And I do think that's really interesting. And yeah, I think it's nice when an actor is so much like the character. And I'll get back to the main point, but also one thing I would love to know is how he felt about the smoking addiction storylines on Friends for Chandler. It'd be really interesting to find out kind of how that came up, how he responded to that, because obviously as he goes through the Friends stuff once he's got it, as I say, I'll get back on track, but he's talking about kind of in the different seasons how his addiction was, kind of which substances he was addicted to potentially, whether he was sober, whether he was really not sober. And I mean, the smoking comes up quite a bit throughout the entire show. So yeah, I would be interested to see how that linked, especially because, yeah, so much clearly of Chandler is like him, but that's natural with shows that, you know, they bring some of the actor into the character, right? We know that they do that, but it's so interesting that, yeah, just from the pilot, scripted without him attached to it, it was him. It's really cool. And yeah, as we've said about the humour, the sarcasm, that really is, you know, it comes through in his writing of this book, how much he does, you know, speak like Chandler and have that same humour and response to stuff that's interesting. But obviously, yes, a different person, and that comes through as well. So yes, it was really, like anxiety inducing listening to it, and being like, when's he going to get it though? You know, and because we know that he does. I'm reminded now talking about it of when we were talking about Bob Mortimer's one, and I was saying, like, I imagine it's a different experience for people who know what co-stars he got on certain shows, whereas I didn't, and I was listening to the book like not knowing. But obviously for this one, you know, if you're coming to this book, you know that he got the role. And you know, he'll obviously explicitly say that in the book anyway, even if you for somehow didn't know that and came across this. So you know that he gets it, but it's a really long journey to try and get it. As you say, he's attached to this other show, and that's what I think is really interesting. It gives you some real industry insight into this whole thing of like pilot runs, and you know, he was the last actor cast that pilot season. You know, I find it fascinating how, certainly back then at least, how, you know, network television ran and the kind of stuff about pilots, and then would you get picked up, would it be dropped, this high idea that, yeah, if you're an actor that's attached to one show, you can't make it onto another. And it's something that, if you find that interesting, definitely it's a reason to listen to this audiobook. But also, very quickly, some recommendations. The Fake Doctors Real Friends Scrubs Rewatch podcast does a lot of talking about that process, which is how I kind of came to this with a bit more understanding of it, because I'd heard it through that. And also, similarly, I haven't listened to many episodes of this yet, but the New Girl Watch Along Rewatch podcast talks about how the actor for Winston had a very similar situation, and the whole kind of the changing of the cast in the first season of that, and how flatmates came in and out was all about which jobs they were attached to and things. That's really fascinating. Specifically I found it fascinating in this, but yes, frustrating for him, and just so glad that he got it, because clearly he was the right person for it. And good that he got it. A shame that it put a strain on that relationship with the friend who should have taken it, if we're thinking objectively, but glad that they sort of were able to reconcile that. And then the behind the scenes industry stuff, both in that getting into it, and then also once you're actually there, you know, the behind the scenes stuff of Friends was interesting to find out about. Is it a show that you watched much? Do you know it well?
I mean, like when I was kind of like in my early teens, kind of like early secondary school, it was an absolutely massive show. It kind of like I kind of have memories of like when it debuted, everyone in school was talking about it. Was kind of like Friday night. I think he uses the phrase himself, it was appointment TV, to kind of talk about that and kind of go through all those things. And one of the things that he also kind of mentions in the book is his unrequited crush on
Jennifer Aniston.
On Jennifer Aniston.
The second time she's come up in our British Book Award series.
So it's kind of, I felt because everyone was in love with Rachel from Friends, but that it's kind of quite interesting that how he kind of talks about that and kind of trying to manage those kind of early, the way the producers of the show wanted to kind of curate a chemistry between the cast, and how David Schwimmer kind of took this, not necessarily leadership role, but it's kind of like, we need to kind of all be in this together, we'll negotiate as a team. And it was kind of, I found those sections quite interesting, especially as he goes on to talk about how he didn't want to derail it and how he was kind of working as a semi-functional addict as well, not wanting to derail it, but kind of eventually that monster does kind of get on his back as well.
No, definitely. Also, another thing that I really found interesting about this, and that, fellow Friends fans will, was the behind the scenes of some of the guest stars. So Hank is one of his friends that comes up earlier in the book, and obviously he has a big spot on Friends. I'm a big fan of that character as well. But the main two stories that are interesting are Bruce Willis's guest spot, how that came about, and also Julia Roberts' guest spot, which was quite the story that I didn't know anything about how that came about. So that was really interesting. I wasn't aware
they were dating at
all. No,
all.
exactly.
And
certainly not, kind of the order that things happened in to mean that she ended up on there. So that was, really interesting, exciting behind the scenes, which, yes, a lot of diehard Friends fans might know already. But if you don't know it already, or if you just want to hear it from the horse's mouth, then, I think that's really interesting, fun stuff to listen to.
So I think one of the things that kind of you mentioned, like the Bruce Willis and Julia Roberts, one of the other things that does come through is like how Matthew really has a lot of like jealousy and envy kind of when he's working with Bruce. It's like, this is what it's like to be like an A-lister, and I really want that for myself. And kind of I found that kind of like quite interesting. You're a really successful bloke, mate. You kind of like... You don't really, you're earning lots of money, you're quite, well regarded and all the rest of it. And still there's always something else to kind of aim for. So, I think that's one of the things that he does talk about when it comes to his addiction, is how he would sacrifice his friend's career, all of that, if so long as he was freed from his addiction, because it's difficult.
The way he sort of talks about fame and this kind of idea that he thought fame would fix things, and acknowledges that he did reach a massive height of fame, and that kind of thing that people think is like, when you get to that point you're going to have nothing to complain about, but that the addiction has such a hold on his life that he'd give all of that up to not have to deal with that. And also just that in general fame doesn't fix stuff is interesting. And I think that's one of the follies of fame and searching for fame, is there's always going to be someone more famous, that's just a fact, or at least you're always going to feel like there's someone more famous, and that kind of sense, I think, as well, of moving between TV and film. Okay, you'll be the biggest TV star, but you're not the biggest film star, and that kind of stuff that is really quite interesting.
I mean, he did. I think I remembered the name of his friend. I think his name was Craig Bierko. And he said to kind of, after they kind of got back to get together, he said to Craig, look, dude, the fame doesn't do for you what you think it's going to do for you. So I think the last thing we probably should discuss is his addiction. And as any kind of stories that involve addict, it's deeply, like for me, it's kind of like deeply frustrating, because you just think, just sort yourself out, but it's not possible. It's not that easy. And he just, the litany. Okay, so I don't want to be like mean about his narration, because he does perform his narration beautifully. But when I first started listening to it, I thought he sounds a bit like drunk. Kind of his speech sounds a little bit slurred. So it's obviously the alcohol and the drugs and everything else has kind of done damage to the way he's able to speak. Did you notice that as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I really wanted to speak about this, and because even from just listening to the preview thing before actually listening to the full book, his voice is very different. And so this is from the thing of like, we've listened to hours and hours and hours of him speaking through, the whole Friends catalogue. And this was many years ago. So obviously there's, aging in there as well.
His voice does get deeper and stuff like this.
But also, the medical stuff that he's gone through, kind of the addiction in general, and what the drugs and alcohol have done, as well as the recent severe medical things. He sounds unwell, unfortunately. And slurred, yes, but also incredibly slow. And I kind of feel like I copped out a little bit, but it did make me very uncomfortable to listen, because it just made me so sad, because he does sound very ill, and just, as I say, very different to how he did. And I sort of, as I say, I feel like I bailed out of that discomfort by speeding it up. Largely because I didn't want to have to face how affected he is, kind of thing, right? And I appreciate problematic, but that's sort of what my gut reaction was that it was making me really upset to hear how yet much he's been changed in a sort of in a negative way about it. But then, so I did speed it up, had it on quite a speed, to a point where I think it felt more like he does with Chandler. He sounded younger, he sounded more energetic, and it matches the text more. The text, as we've said, it is a really enthusiastic text, and it's got a lot of humour in it, and you can, because he does express really well, you can hear the expression that he puts into the lines. At least when you speed it up, you can really hear it. And then I would take myself and go and slow it down again and be like, is it there? And it's like, well, obviously it's there because he must have said it for it to come across when sped up, right? But when it's so slow, you can't really tell the same expression and emphasis and, and the tone that he uses and all that. But when you speed it up, you can. And I also was so kind of, I don't know what the right word is, but so it preoccupied me so much about this. And like I say, I was speeding up and slowing down throughout. And I also went and found on YouTube some recent interviews with him, sort of, it was going to be around the same time that he was recording this. And I'll be honest, he sounded better in those interviews than he did recording, as in he sounded, he was speaking much quicker. And it was very odd. It's almost as if this audiobook is slowed down. Because, like I say, it feels natural, sped up. It's almost as if he recorded it and then they went and did it at, a minus times something and slowed it down even further from even what he is, as I say, on a recent interview where he's talking. So it is something very much, we're talking about this in the context of it being audio. It's something we had to bring up. I hope I've spoken about it appropriately. But yeah, it is something to factor in. I do think, as you said, he narrates it well. He puts the emphasis in the right place. He puts the expression in there. But with how slow the base level of the audiobook is, that doesn't always necessarily come through. Yeah. And yet what does come through is that he is so changed. And that, the years of the substance abuse and the significant medical things that he's gone through, we don't know how recently he last had a surgery before he got in the studio,
that might have had effect,
Yeah, you can hear that he's going through a difficult time and has been through some difficult stuff. You can hear that in his voice. But it was definitely the right person to record it.
Yeah.
But it is something we have to note about the audio, that it is significantly slower than we would have expected him to sound.
Yeah, so I find it fascinating you mentioned that, because I agree with you. It does. There is kind of like a slight slurring. The pace is a little bit slower than I'd expect. I listened to most of the book on regular speed.
Right. Okay.
Because I had this week off, so I had time just to kind of like sit there and listen. And I think maybe there's a couple of things to why the delivery was maybe a little bit slower than I would have expected. And I think one of the things is that he is talking about some really painful periods.
Sure,
and maybe he's just thinking, right, he's needing to process that. And when we get onto kind of Richard E. Grant's book, there's certainly moments in that book where kind of like his emotions get the better of him. And I think that's maybe true in here as well. He does kind of maybe trying to hide how much pain he is by kind of throwing in lots of witty asides and stuff like that. And maybe there's a concentration there. But yeah, he's been through a lot. I mean, in terms of the, I think he mentioned in the book he's had 14 stomach surgeries. All his teeth have fallen out. That's definitely got to have an effect on the way that you narrate as well. So like his body's really been through the ringer as well. And he does kind of talk, I don't know how to approach this, because he does talk unflinchingly about, right, these are all the things that I did to kind of get hold of like opiates and narcotics and drugs, kind of like, and he's talking from a real place of privilege, because he's immensely wealthy. So he's able to pay for the best doctors, a sober companion. He's got a personal assistant, all these kind of different things. And he's still lying and cheating and trying to sneak in pills or cigarettes or alcohol into kind of whatever situation he's kind of been put in to try and get himself clean. And it does kind of, on one hand, I was thinking, well, like, dude, you've got all the tools that you need to get the treatment that you need. But then on the other hand, it kind of does really emphasize how overpowering addiction can be, because here's someone who's got on the surface, like, all the resources that you would need to kind of like, not beat addiction, but kind of like manage his life in such a way where it's not as big as a problem. And I think the overwhelming sense that I got at the end of the book is this is he talks a lot at the end of the book, how much he really wants to have a wife or a girlfriend and settle down and have some kids, and kind of I had a really overwhelming sense of sadness about the fact that I don't know if he's ever going to have that.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the kind of things I was feeling kind of towards the end of the book. Yeah.
No, that's fair. And I think it's definitely been a theme throughout a lot of this shortlist about access to medical care. It's definitely been a thing. And yeah, I think you make a very good point. Obviously, he is talking from this position of, being able to get all that help, as well as, being able to pay so much for the drugs in the first place. Yeah. I think there was one point where he's talking about how much he was paying someone specifically for.
Yeah, something like thousands of pounds a week. Yeah.
So,
thousands of dollars a week, yeah.
Yeah, it's very much said within that context. And yeah, it is interesting that is something that's been a theme across a lot of the shortlist. Also, just on medical things, I did want to point out, because it did stick out to me quite a bit. He talks about how after this stomach surgery and he had a colostomy bag, and basically talking about how much he didn't want one. And I just wanted to put it out there a little bit as a trigger warning, because if you do have one, he doesn't speak particularly acceptingly about it. Yeah. And I know there's a big push, rightly so, at the moment for destigmatizing colostomy bags, and, particularly think, relate this to Edward and Nichols, about fashion around stuff like that. And, I've seen things of kind of like swimwear models and stuff and showing colostomy bags, and I'm very much in support of, reducing the stigma around it, because there shouldn't be. But wanting to therefore flag it, Matthew Perry has not yet reached that level of appreciation for how important it is to destigmatize it. Doesn't really help and is really quite derogatory about it, but obviously is opening up his experience and how he had felt that it was a bad thing and that it was something that he really didn't want, and that he did use it as a motivator for helping to cut down on his drug use and try and stop his addiction and various things like that. But and I think then talking about this, how the addiction really just, despite all those resources, keeps relapsing and things like that. And I think, as you were saying, what it really does is it just highlights it's not that easy. It's not a case of just willpower,
Yeah.
And I think that's very much what this book is showing, for anyone who thinks addiction is just a case of willpower and just, but it's not that hard, just stop it. It isn't a case of that, and it is a real battle.
Yeah.
But I did think, you seem to disagree, but I did think that he ended it on a hopeful note. I guess it doesn't end it with 100%, I'm going to be sober forever, I'll never relapse again, but he does end it at a point where he's feeling like staying sober is possible. And maybe corners have been turned.
Maybe I misinterpreted the way that he said it, but I think the reason why he said, well, I bottom out, kind of like the opiates don't work on me anymore. Kind of like all the other drugs that he was taking don't have, he'd have to take such a ridiculous amount
to feel
to have
it.
any effect. Yeah, to feel it, that it's kind of like, there's basically no point. But that doesn't mean the destructive behavior is not still there.
Yeah.
So I think there's just a couple of things that we do need to talk about before we move on to the next book. One of them is quite, I don't know, say serious misstep, but there is a misstep in here where he does kind of mention Keanu Reeves a few times. That's been in the news, and I think we do need to kind of mention it as well. Most of the time when he's making jokes about something, he kind of, I think he hits the right target a lot of the time, but this was like, I don't know what he was thinking by choosing like Keanu Reeves as the target of that particular joke. He could have chosen lots and lots and lots of other people to be the target of that particular joke. And for those of you who aren't aware, there's a section in the book where he kind of talks about one of his friends, River Phoenix, passing away from a drugs overdose. They kind of worked on what was Matthew Perry's first film, and that's kind of a really important moment in his life. And he says that, River Phoenix has died, but kind of Keanu Reeves is still around. It's like dude, like, what's Keanu done to you, man? It's just weird. And that, those references are going to be removed in subsequent editions. I don't know how that's going to affect the audiobook, where he needs to re-record it or whatever, but it's just, how did you feel about that? I just thought it was like a really weird misstep to make.
Yeah, so I'd actually noted it down when I listened to it, because I was shocked by it, because effectively saying that someone deserves to die, which is a very harsh thing to say. And I had noted it down, and then it was like a day or two later that my mum sent me the article about it being removed. So yeah, I was like, well, I'm glad, because it really stuck out to me when I listened to it. So I am glad. And yeah, he does say that he wasn't meaning it as an attack for him. It was a badly written joke. By the fact that he just plucked a random name when really he shouldn't have targeted it at someone. Or he then says, kind of, or at me, which I guess would at least say the kind of idea of that he has throughout the book of, I shouldn't be alive. All these procedures that he went through, he shouldn't have survived them. And that kind of survivor's guilt that he has is more what the joke was about, I think, or meant to be about. But yeah, it still shouldn't have targeted there, wasn't right. And yeah, glad that is going to be actioned, because it was particularly harsh. And I think there was bits throughout it where I think he's been a bit harsh. I mean, as I say, his kind of...
he's quite acerbic, isn't he? He's kind of like quite,
yeah, like I say, some of his thoughts or some of the things that he says about women, I'm a bit like, and some of the things that he says about other people. And, there was the guy who beat him at an award show, and beat him for like all the awards at the award show, and he was quite cruel about him as well, and about dentists in general. And things like that, where I think you can maybe take it as he is trying to make a joke and doesn't believe it, and is maybe misjudging how funny it will come across. So yes, not saying that all the jokes are perfect. I do think it's still fair to say that it's still a funny book. There are some very well-placed jokes that do read the room. These ones did not, and I hope that it is just a miswritten joke rather than something he actually feels.
I can't believe that got through the editing.
Again,
I just beyond me how that got through the edit. It's just like
Agreed.
Anyway. But he does come across as someone that wants to be in control of have some extensive control of his creative process. Because the other section that kind of grabbed me as well was him talking with Aaron Sorkin as well, but
but on that I did find, because that's the thing where a lot of the tone that you get is I think this is the phrase, is maybe not the nicest person. It was really interesting learning how much he was like Chandler, but this is where I think you find out the differences where he's not, because there was some not niceness that came across in some of what he's done. But also I think, this is a lot of the case of what you get with celebrities, and he was talking about how the fact that they were all bitching about each other, and there's some of that in the next book we're going to talk about that was talking about, celebrities will get together and talk about how they hate all the other celebrities. So, I think there is something of that in there. But there's maybe some bits where he doesn't necessarily come across as super nice. But then when you're talking about kind of him wanting to have control of the creative process, there was one bit that made me go, I'm pleasantly surprised by your approach to this, because he was talking about a job that he was on where he was pitching jokes and pitching changes to the script, and this guy really didn't want to take any of them on. It was, we're just going to run it this way. And the way that Matthew says, and that's his right. I may not have been super happy about it, but he's running his show. He can have ownership of it. That was great. And I just thought that in contrast to, some of the small, this is a minor part of the book, but some of the small bits where he doesn't come across as particularly nice, I was pleasantly surprised by how maturely he talked about that, and how much respect he gave for other creatives to say, I may not agree with you, but you have full authority to do that, and I respect that. So there's a good balance in there, and I'm not in any way tarring him as a nasty person, but just there was points where he wasn't as nice as you'd hoped he'd be, not as nice as you think Chandler is, kind of thing was all that came across to me. So
I think this is well worth listening to, especially if you're a fan of Friends. I imagine there's kind of quite a few out there. I think it's also kind of probably worth listening to if you've got any interest in addiction, just to be, it's kind of his take on that. But do go and being aware that, while he does perform the text beautifully, kind of hitting the human notes and the sad notes and all that stuff, you might be a little bit shocked at the state of his voice. And I don't want to be mean about that, but it does sound damaged. What were your closing thoughts?
I pretty much agree with what you said. I thought it was a good book. I really enjoyed it. I got a lot of enjoyment out of listening to this one. I think we'll go on to talk about the next one, but I listened to this after A Pocketful of Happiness, and I enjoyed this a lot more. If you have listened back on the podcast and for Head, you'll know I haven't really listened to memoirs and autobiographies for very long. It's only been like the last couple of years that I've got into these, and this one I really enjoyed. Was a Friends fan and was interested in that. I was interested in learning about the addiction stuff, which I think is presented really well. And just in general, it's written really well. We agree on that. We maybe think, yeah, it could have been edited better for like those repeats and potentially some content. But yeah, that it's written extremely well, and the performance, not necessarily considering the speed, but is still really well performed, really enthusiastic, and really enjoyable to listen to. So yeah, I recommend it. I think it's good.
Okay, cool. And then the next book that we're going to be talking about, and kind of the last one on the shortlist, is A Pocketful of Happiness by Richard E. Grant, as narrated by the author. An intimate and uplifting memoir. Born in Swaziland in 1957, Richard E. Grant moved to the UK to pursue his acting career, and has been a fixture on our screens since his breakout role in Whitnell and I in 1987. When his beloved wife Joan died in 2021, after almost 40 years together, she set him a challenge to find a pocket full of happiness in every day. The result is this book. Set between the present day and flashbacks to delightfully indiscreet diary entries recalling landmarks from his remarkable life and glittering career, this is an immensely personal and profound memoir that celebrates and cherishes life's unexpected joys. Funny, moving and perceptive, A Pocketful of Happiness is an insight into the life of a much-loved British actor. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is whenever you're listening to a book, you always bring your own personal baggage to it in terms of how you interpret things. And I think, as some of the listeners might be aware, my mum passed away from lung disease a few years ago now. So a lot of what Richard talks about in the book in terms of the medical aspects and kind of also the emotional aspects of kind of receiving the news that someone that you love is terminally ill resonated with me quite a lot. And I can kind of fully understand why this book is on the list, because it is, we mentioned kind of like Matthew Perry's book is kind of unflinching in the way that he's, you know, looks at all the terrible things that he's done to those around him. I think this book is equally unflinching in the way that it kind of opens up this kind of raw, sore wound about the, you know, the pain of losing someone that you've loved for most of your life. Getting that out of the way, what were your kind of initial first impressions of it as well?
Yeah, so this very much is about that. It's about his wife's cancer diagnosis and her deterioration and her death, and fundamentally it was just quite bleak, and I kind of struggled with that and struggled to find the enjoyment out of it, even if it's not like kind of haha yay I'm loving this enjoyment, because that's not what I had with the previous book either. That enjoyment is very different, but I did struggle to find enjoyment in it because it was just really tough. And yeah, you know, this kind of pocket full of happiness thing, it was hard to see the happy in it. There's a lot that's just really sad, and I think for me it just really took its toll how much that was. I think obviously that is what the book is largely about, and so, you know, does what it says on the tin, not necessarily saying that it's doing anything it shouldn't do. And maybe it's about the mood I was in, the things going on in my life, all that sort of stuff while I was listening to it. But yeah, I struggled to enjoy it and struggled to get through it because it is, I think it is a really sad book. So yeah.
That's really fascinating that you felt that way. I mean, there's certainly things where that sadness and pain are kind of explored, and he kind of, you know, how he expresses how hurt he is by the loss of his wife, and how the process of taking care of her while she was dying took a lot out of him. But I wouldn't say I felt, I mean, I certainly did feel sad, but like, I think I've came away with it with maybe he wanted to be slightly more celebratory about his wife's and his relationship. And yes, I didn't struggle to get through with it the same way. Maybe that's because I've been through this. I'm kind of, I know, you know, what those feelings are like, and I'm able to kind of empathize with that a little bit more.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a hard for me. There were certain sections, especially when he's talking about when they get the initial diagnosis, I found kind of quite tough, because that did bring back memories of sitting down with my mum's doctor and, those sections where after she passed away, where after his wife passed away, that kind of reminded me of the sections with my mum. But yeah, I didn't struggle to get through it the same way that you did.
No, that's
so
fair.
I think that's kind of quite interesting.
Yeah, and it was also something that I was thinking of while I was going through it, is that I think fundamentally I'm quite different to both him and his wife, and certainly kind of the way they express their relationship for each other and their love for each other and the way that they interact with each other is just very different to how I ever would. And so that by no means in any way, delegitimizes their love and how powerful and strong it was, but I think it weakened how much it affected me, if that makes sense. So obviously we've had a bit recently where people have been talking about their significant other, and it's, been very moving. And I'm not saying that this isn't moving, but I'm saying that in direct comparison, having listened to them, very close together, this didn't have the same impact for me, but I think I can very clearly identify the reason why, and it's just because I express love in a different way, and that's not what my relationships have ever looked like. It's not what my current relationship looks like. And so I think, as well as, struggling with the sadness of the terminal illness content, I also maybe wasn't as invested in the relationship. Kind of, obviously they're not characters, they are real people, but if we were talking about this in a fiction sense, it would just be a case of, I didn't really, connect with or identify with their relationship, and that made it harder to get into the story. And so, putting that back into this, I think that was part of what it was as well, just because they are quite different people.
Yeah, so I think that's probably worth kind of exploring and getting into, I think, a bit. So you kind of mentioned kind of their style of communication. So one of the things that stood out to me about their relationship, and one of the things that Richard talks about in the book is, the impression that I got was that they had a really open style of communication in terms of like trying to explain, well, I'm feeling this and this is why I reacted that way. And kind of the other thing that came across as well, and again, like they do come across as like a pair of lovies, like
lovey-dovey,
kind of lovely theatre. Even when he's kind of, they do come across as like theatre people. I volunteered in a theatre, and you kind of like, you do overhear kind of actors and directors, oh darling, I can't, wasn't able to get a reservation and such restaurant. Oh, did you hear the gossip about so and so? They did, that does very much come across in this book. But one of the things that I did find quite nice is how they had like nicknames for each other. Kind of like his wife never calls him Richard, she calls him like Swazi boy, because that's kind of, and I thought that was kind of quite endearing. And Richard would call his wife Monkey, which I thought was kind of quite funny. And how they never call their daughter by her proper name, just calling her Oily as well. And I just thought that those little details did kind of bring me into the relationship and into their life a little bit more, and I was able to kind of connect with them a little bit. So it's just interesting how you weren't able to and
specifically on the names thing, I quite liked how the name Oily came first, and then they created a real name for other family members to be on board with, which I thought was quite funny, and really nice.
Well, she needs a government name, isn't it?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, like, none of this is, I think they did seem like lovely people. It was just that I felt a distance, I guess, because I couldn't feel myself in there. But as I say, we don't know all sorts of external factors that made me less enthralled by this book. But I think the darkness of the subject matter, and I guess my unwillingness to be kept in that space so much at the moment. Also think it's worth noting, I was maybe going to send this at the end of the podcast, but I'm happy to say it now, like, obviously there's been some tough content in a lot of these books that we've been reviewing, that Fahed and I have listened to in quite a short space of time to get these all out before the awards event, and I wouldn't recommend binging them all at once is what I'm going to say. And so I do think there'll be a bit of me that I'd been bogged down in some dark stuff. I think Nanette was the one I'd listened to just before that. I'd been bogged down in some dark stuff.
That would be a tough.
So I think that there's partly that to it as well. And then, like I said, I then was pleasantly surprised that even though Matthew Perry's had, such dark stuff about addiction, that it brought me up a bit of a level after listening to this one. But so I wasn't really engaging with it as much, didn't love it as much. And I think also, as I just alluded to before, this felt to me like what I imagined memoirs and autobiographies were before I encountered them.
Okay.
And that's not a criticism of them at all. It's just a kind of I can see how other people would enjoy this, but I'm not massively into it kind of thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I necessarily enjoyed it. I would say I got a lot out of it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So
Definitely makes sense. I also want to say, so because it is very much framed around his wife and certainly about her cancer, but it does have some stuff about his career in acting and some similarities with Matthew Perry's one of kind of behind the scenes things. I would say if you've not watched Loki and you don't want spoilers, then you might want to avoid it. There's definitely some spoilers in that. If you've not seen the recent Star Wars, there's some spoilers. Luckily, I have seen the recent Star Wars, obviously. And I really enjoyed for them specifically learning some of the behind the scenes of that, and a crossover again between the two books, learning about how on some sets, obviously we knew this is a thing, but knowing which one specifically, right? How on some sets they're happy to change the text on the day. They're happy for the actors to help them change the text. They'll give them new text at last minute. On other ones, it's the text is what the text is. You better get it exactly right. And so, yeah, especially with being a Star Wars fan, it was interesting learning about behind the scenes for that, how the scripting stuff worked, how the relationship between the actors worked, when they found things out, all the sorts of behind the scenes there was good. So that was interesting to hear about. But that was kind of the only thing of his acting credits that I'd really seen. So I think that was probably another reason.
Have you not seen Whitnell and I?
No, I haven't yet. No,
it's a really good film. It's a really good film.
But no, haven't yet. So that might be another reason why I didn't connect with this as much, because it wasn't a person whose work I knew very much about. But yes, I've got some recommendations to go away with for sure. I'm not putting this as a good thing that I hadn't come across a lot of his work. It's just the state of it that I hadn't.
That's actually kind of quite fascinating, because one of the things that he does mention in the book was like, to me, he's kind of quite a famous person, but he does mention in the book, well, there's always going to be someone that doesn't recognize you, who hasn't seen anything that you've been in, and you just got to take that as a little bit of medicine for your ego. I
knew he was famous, and I knew him, and I knew his face. I just hadn't seen him in much. But interesting.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of some of the events in this story. So he talks about him coming to London, him meeting the woman that would kind of like he'd kind of fall in love with, and I found that section of how their courtship quite funny and kind of quite endearing. He does come, his performance, generally speaking, he does come across as kind of quite endearing, and there's kind of an excitement when he meets like a new celebrity. Him kind of being like as excited as a regular person would be, but I found their courtship quite interesting. Him staying, the first time they slept together was like him staying over at her house after kind of like she's a really well regarded vocal and accent coach, and all lots and lots of actors and directors kind of go to her to help coach the accents and things like that, and that's why he initially approached her. And I felt kind of like his ability to have what I've put down on my notes is like cold room riz, in terms of like just going into like him staying over at her house because like the trains had left, being in like a cold room in her flat, and then just kind of like walking into her bedroom and just like saying, "Oh, can I jump in there?" I'm just thinking like I would never.
It feels a bit creepy to me, not gonna lie. But it worked out well. She was okay with it.
I think if you say it like that, but obviously like they were sending out signals, maybe, probably, definitely, because they were together kind of for 40 years. So I found those opening sections about their courtship quite fascinating. The other thing that I really struck a nerve with me was that she, at the start of their relationship, was far more successful than he was, and then there's that kind of like reversal, and he talks. I found it really fascinating when that kind of reverse is like, before she was kind of like the big person in the room that everyone would want to talk to, and she would be kind of like taking him to all these parties to introduce him to casting directors and other people and stuff like that. But then that kind of reversed, and he talks a little bit how that took a long while for her to kind of get used to as well. And I felt that was kind of a really interesting thing about, they were together for 40 years, so there's going to be like Troughton follows in a relationship and how they dealt with that, I found was fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. That is interesting. And I also think it's a point because it's like, it's not that she wasn't successful anymore or anything like that, but I think also the thing of like the actors are the ones where you see their faces all the time, you know?
Yeah.
So even him reaching that kind of height of fame then ends up becoming that he's more known than she is, even though, because she never stopped being so highly thought of in the industry and so requested, and everyone having such amazing things to say about her and in such high demand. So and one of the real takeaways from this is how much people loved her. He does a very good job of bringing that into the book, both through kind of like actually reading out some of stuff that they've said, but just in everything else that's the stories that he tells, you know, showing how much so many people loved her, you know, that had met her professionally most of the time. It was just really, really wonderful and lovely.
Yeah, I think I was reading a couple of reviews around the book just to try and get my own thoughts in order. And one of the things that a few of the reviewers mention is how this book is like not only a tribute to his wife, because he does kind of extol her virtues not only as a vocal coach but as a wife and as a mother and as a partner and a supporter of all the things that he did and kind of guiding him through various things, but also a tribute to the things that love makes us do for people, kind of in terms of caring for people when they are sick and unwell and treating you badly and all those sorts of things. So I think that also kind of came across quite strongly to me as well. And yet there is a section at the end of the book which what's the right word, it's not like an epilogue but like maybe an appendix,
Maybe
so where he reads out these tributes from all these really famous Hollywood actors that were students of Joan. You know, a lot of them saying, well, you know, she was an amazing teacher, I would never have like being able to perform the role that I was doing as well. And that, you know, just the list of names that were coming in. And there was, you know, other vocal coaches, you know, based in the United States, saying that she basically established that role in this country. So, and the other thing that Richard and I think his family and friends tried to do was try and get her on. Is it a nomination? What's the word?
It was like a Lifetime Achievement Award kind of thing. I can't remember the specific one.
I think she's trying to get her like a damehood, I think is what it was, to try and get her formal royal honour. And that was the other touching part of the book, was that all these letters of recommendation and tributes and stuff like that, they kind of put into a book. And, you know, Richard asks Joan, do you want to read this book? And she says no, but then he kind of subsequently finds out later on that she did read the book, but she maybe didn't want to read it in front of Richard. And I found that kind of quite touching, really, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is a huge, overwhelming thing from the book of, seeing how loved she was as a person, and also, what a trailblazer in the industry kind of thing. You know, that's sort of what we talked about with Edward's one as well. The kind of impact that she'd made is really cool. And so obviously the way that they'd met was because he'd gone to her for vocal coaching, and sort of poshing up his accent. And maybe that's also another reason why I felt a bit distant from the book, because he does have an incredibly posh RP voice, and potentially there was a bit of me feeling some resentment there, who knows. But also because of that, when he does accents in the book, they're also really good, or at least, you know, he does them. And I find that enjoyable. So there's a few different ones, and there's some like kind of where maybe there's
impressions
obviously
and stuff like that. Yeah,
there's obviously the one where he's like doing the Doctor's Australian accent, but also like other actors, like Donald Gleeson, he does an Irish accent for him and stuff like that. So a pro point of the audio there, definitely. While we're on that though, I did think it was quite a clicky, shuffly recording. It didn't feel like it was as crisp as some of the others, and I know it's potentially a bit rich me saying that. I'm aware that at least on my end the audio quality is not always perfect. We're working on it. We're just doing this from home and teaching ourselves, but for a big book for like that, I don't know, I was a bit disappointed. I think it got better. It's sort of a note from earlier on in my notes, and I didn't necessarily feel it too much by the end, but it's something to notice that I thought it was markedly a bit shuffly, a bit noisy and stuff like that. Sort of connected with that bonus for the audio, there's some bits where you have of the thing that he's talking about, you have the actual recording of it. So he had a voice memo recording, and earlier at the start he had like an Instagram reel or whatever that he'd put out, and I thought it was really good that they got the actual audio from those things rather than him reading out again whatever he'd said, you know, because you actually get the emotion of what he was feeling at the time, and you actually specifically get the thing that he's talking about. That's a huge plus of the audio, I reckon.
Yeah, cool. So I think we kind of like briefly mentioned the section towards the kind of end of the book where he talks about kind of like the dying process. And I think he really eloquently expresses how painful and difficult that can be. And he kind of pays tribute to kind of the nurses and the doctors, and the other health assistants, you know, in the NHS and kind of like hospice organizations that kind of smooth that process over. And I think, you know, that's kind of quite similar to my experience as well. Like the NHS and the North London Hospice were kind of absolutely amazing in terms of the support they provided towards my mum. So I kind of really wanted to touch on that. The other thing that I wanted to touch on, which is kind of maybe in the complete opposite direction, kind of Richard does come across as kind of quite a quirky character, kind of he's, you know, got lots of anecdotes about weird things that have happened to him, but I think the standout one for me is his kind of obsession with like Barbra Streisand. How did you kind of like feel, because sometimes you do wonder sometimes, oh, is this all authentic? But it's kind of, that's such a weird thing. I don't know, is Barbra Streisand like, I don't know, but discuss.
I don't know, I think it's obviously, it does end up being a big part of the book. It's clearly a big part of his life. And as you say, a bit quirky and interesting. I didn't for a second doubt that he was being real and authentic about it. I don't know what that says about him. But it's an interesting, nice insight to the character and also to their relationship. You know, there's sort of jokes about, kind of any jealousy that might or might not be there and kind of how open they are, which is something that's really great about the relationship. As I said, how open they are. And this kind of joke about this love affair. This very one-sided love affair kind of thing that's quite funny. But one thing I did find interesting actually was kind of, there was a bit where Oily kind of said to him, she doesn't want to hear about your one-sided love affair now. And there was a thing about kind of it being the right moment, and you can tell that this is clearly a couple who, you know, use humour as a way to get through stuff, and we've talked about how important that is. But it was interesting having that real, like, you know, dead set, this isn't the time, kind of, this is where the boundaries are kind of thing. That was kind of, if you want to see it as a motif, it was interesting how that Barbra Streisand thing kept coming up, and the different ways when it was a really funny joke, when it brought them together, when it was, oh my gosh, I'm actually meeting her, and it was all about that, and when it was kind of this marks a significant kind of moment, because this is no longer what we can, this is not a time to joke kind of thing.
And I think the other kind of thing that does come across here is kind of like how much he wants to share with his wife throughout his life. And kind of one of the big things was like when he was nominated for an Oscar, and like she said, I can't be there. It's just like, it's too
so
demanding. Kind of like how sad he was about that, and you know how he did understand it, but it's kind of like, well, I love you and I want you to be there because this is like a really important special thing. And so that is kind of also kind of quite touching.
Definitely. On that moment specifically, that was really, really sad. And it's so difficult because you can see both sides of it. You can see how much he really wants her there. You can also see how, you know, physically she's not in the best place where she can. And that was really tough and really tense. And that was a point where I could, you know, I identify certainly with the relationship of, you want to be there to support your partner. You want your partner to be there to support you. It was just a really poignant moment, I think. I also wanted to touch on what you'd said about the shout out to the NHS doctors and stuff like that, and obviously completely in support of that. And again, this is what we've been saying, that access to medical care has been a big theme throughout the shortlist. I kind of, I was interested to hear when he was explicitly saying it was NHS, because until that point I wasn't sure that it was. Maybe part of that is me assuming because they're famous or whatever, but also I felt like how quickly they got an appointment during the height of lockdown seemed not to tally up with what I'd heard of other people's experiences. But yeah, so I guess I was glad to hear when it was NHS, very glad to hear of that shout out. Maybe cynical, this is complete conjecture. I did wonder, because it isn't acknowledged, I did wonder how much went to her standing. You know, we talked about in Edward Enninfull's how he got an appointment with a doctor because someone he knew them. And yes, this might still be through the NHS, but I don't know how much was done on it. It was clear that at least one doctor did know of her in that professional capacity and that it was known that she was famous. I don't know. To me, it felt a bit inaccessible how much the kind of the treatment was, as I say, specifically during lockdown and things like that. But it was interesting hearing about how lockdown did affect it. And yeah, comparison with what you brought up about parenting hell. You know, this is a lockdown book and it is within the context of that. And I'm glad to hear that you felt that, yeah, you had a similar experience, and hopefully it's me just being very cynical.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of build up on that point, I would say my mum received similar levels of care in terms of like getting access to doctor's appointments and stuff like that that Joan did. I don't think there was kind of like any different. I think maybe, and I'm not, I'd have to kind of like compare the timelines. Like my mum was sick for a considerable amount of time before she was kind of like diagnosed with like terminal lung disease. But in terms of after that diagnosis came in, I would say there was no difference between the care that she received and what Joan received as well. As far as I could tell, maybe they were rich and they were able to they had access to other resources in terms of like cottages and friends' houses and stuff like this. But if you've got a large network of family friends, I don't know. I don't think that was particularly. I don't think they got any more or less medical care due to the kind of the privileged position.
Yeah.
That they were in. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm glad to hear that. And yeah, as I say, it may be an unfair comment from me, and it was more just kind of how I'd felt up until the point where he acknowledges, okay, this was NHS, and I was like, okay, great, good. I'm glad, because it seemed like it was sort of inaccessible. As I say, is kind of how it had felt. But yeah, on a very different note, one of the last things I wanted to talk about was just about the writing style. So again, this might be another reason why I just really didn't connect with it as much, is that because a lot of it, as it mentions in the blurb, is like diary entries, it's kind of written with a style that kind of suits that, I guess. It felt very bullet pointy to me. Kind of the main thing that comes up a lot is that like the subject of the sentence isn't there. Like the sentence starts with a verb. It's like, went downstairs and she was doing this. That's what I mean by like bullet pointy and doesn't have the subject of the sentence. There was a lot of that and I didn't like it. I didn't enjoy that, and therefore I think the prominence of that throughout the entire book is probably just another reason on there as to why it wasn't the kind of book for me. But yeah, so did you disagree? Did you like that style?
I kind of quite enjoyed that. Fair. Because it gave a real sense of like presence of him being in that moment. It kind of felt raw and unfiltered. It wasn't, he does write beautifully. He does kind of construct beautiful sentences, but in those moments, especially towards the end, you can kind of just feel that this is like the raw emotion that he's kind of like putting down there. And I think it helped me connect with him a little bit more in terms of like, oh, this is probably, and if I'd done this while my mum was passing away, this is probably the way that I would write that stuff down as well.
Interesting. Okay.
So so that helped me kind of connect with it maybe a little bit more, I think. So yeah,
that's very fair. And yes, certainly the emotion, the rawness isn't something that I necessarily connected with that, but it's very definitely there. And as you've said before, it's there in the performance. He is an actor. You'd expect him to do a good performance of it, and he certainly does. And has that thing that we've talked about across a lot of reviews where you can really hear that emotion. You can hear how tough it was to talk through these things.
You can kind of hear real joy in his voice when he's kind of recounting these celebrity anecdotes, and you can tell towards the end of the book where he's emotionally drained and his voice is broken and stuff like that, and he's taking long pauses between words as well. So he does perform generally quite well. I would say in terms of whether you're going to listen to the audio or not, is that it will depend on how much you enjoy listening to Richard's voice, because it can come out if you're not into kind of like the the lovely theatre darling kind of like aspect of someone's personality. It might be grating to some people, but yeah, like for me, I don't think enjoyed is the right word. I think it helped me kind of explore some of my own emotions around, the experience that I went through. And I think he kind of writes quite pointedly about how kind of like grief is a living thing. It's kind of, it's something that grows with you and stays with you, and you need to find ways of coping with that. And obviously the title of the book is A Pocket Full of Happiness. That can be, I mean, even he himself mentions in the book, because like that can be a really almost nigh on impossible thing to do on some days. But it's kind of, I think what he wants to get across is that grief it's a living thing. It grows and stays with you, and you need to find ways of using it, because like the universe goes on. I mean, this is something that Matthew Perry said in his book as well. The universe is neutral. It's going to go on with you or without you there, and you might as well make a go of trying to do something positive with your life as well. So I would recommend this. What are your kind of closing thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly though, I wanted to say what you said there about grief, because I think it's interesting, because because this book ends kind of shortly after Joan dies. I sort of feel like this is more a book about loss than it is about grief. I know it's a very minor distinction, but I do think it's a point worth raising, that he definitely talks about grief, and he talks about this idea of finding the pocketfuls of happiness and thinking celebratory and all those things about how to deal with someone after they've gone. But it's interesting because it's from the fact that he talked with Joan about that while she was still there. And a lot of this is kind of like preemptive grief kind of conversations, which are just as worthwhile having, just as worthy. But I do think it's, you made me think of it then, the way you were speaking about it, that I wouldn't have, if I were describing it to someone, I wouldn't describe it as a book about grief, because it sort of talks about a different stage of loss than that. That was really interesting. But so for my closing thoughts, I have nothing against this as a book. I'm not in any way saying that it's a bad book, but I didn't get on with it. As I say, I hadn't connected with it as much. I found it very sad. I was very much overwhelmed by the subject matter, and I didn't love the writing style. So, that kind of meant that it wasn't a book for me, but I by no means am saying that I wouldn't recommend it if you think it's the kind of book you would like. I don't have anything negative to say from any sort of objective standpoint. All my criticisms are very much subjective, of things that I didn't get on with that made me think this wasn't my favourite book, but not that I don't think you guys should listen to it. So, yeah.
Okay. It's really interesting how, like, this wasn't the book that I'd expect us to kind of, like, not necessarily disagree on, but it's kind of like...
have such different experiences.
Different experiences. Okay, so because this is the last in our series discussing the books on the Book of the Year audiobook non-fiction shortlist, I think we should probably talk a little bit about maybe trends in the shortlist. Like, most of these are celeb biographies in one form or another, and maybe I found that a little bit disappointing. I think the closest we got to kind of like a subject matter exploration would have been menopausing.
And obviously even that was very focused on Davina's experiences.
Davina's experiences as well. So
was interesting. Also, an interesting just point on that is if you guys have seen the covers, a lot of them look very similar as well. Because very similar books, and the cover design is very interesting, and in general, and how they connect different titles together. But I think there's a lot of similarities across these books. Like we've said, healthcare is very much in here, and even, Matthew Perry's being based in the States, talking about the differences of American healthcare and having to pay for it, as we know very much. So happy to know this is very much a pro NHS shortlist, and some interesting stuff on it, and as well as some really good stuff with kind of audio innovation. So obviously my favourite for that being the Parenting Hell one. And since we recorded our review of that, I've actually gone and listened to some of the podcasts, and I've been enjoying that. And also the little kids saying stuff is clearly been pulled from that. It's been really interesting seeing kind of the stuff where they've clearly gone, okay, this is a thing of the podcast, what should we do with the audiobook? That I think is really clever. as well as obviously we've talked about in both Pocketful of Happiness and in Nanette, how there's been clips of other stuff included in there. It's great. There's been kind of extra bonus commentary in a couple of them. There's been some adaptation in some of them that, it's been interesting across them.
Yeah, kind of menopausing, having different performers.
Exactly, yes, sorry, that was the other thing I wanted to list. Yeah, exactly, the different actors in that and choices. So, yeah, it'd be a really interesting list.
You kind of mentioned access to healthcare. I think the other thing that kind of come across is like most of these, well, obviously a lot of these celebs work in the creative industry, but I think the other thing that comes across is how different people approach the creative process, kind of Edward Enninful trying to constantly push boundaries and not settling for kind of like a hierarchy. Hannah Gadsby trying to break down the norms in like stand-up comedy and not trying to fall into those patterns. Matthew Perry talking about like the Hollywood creative process and how frustrating that can be, or how great that that can be. Richard E. Grant also talks about when he's working on those big budget films like Star Wars, for example. He goes into how much admiration he has for the director there and how many balls he juggle balls or spinning plates, whatever analogy that I'm kind of looking for, and how difficult that can be as well. And even Parenting Hell also talks about kind of them putting the podcast together.
Yeah, and them writing, the fact that they comment on their writing of the book, especially in the ad-libbed sections, that, you see behind that creative process. Completely agree. And, you got that angle that you said about different approaches to it, but literally all of them give you some insight to behind the scenes. I think kind of the least would be menopausing, but even so, because you learn about her, as I said, it was a really tough one for me to hear, but as she was doing live shows and the way she was struggling with that as the kind of mental symptoms of the perimenopause, the kind of forgetting and her eyesight was with the auto cue, learning a little bit about the behind the scenes there. I think that's sort of on the end of the spectrum, but you still have a bit of it. And then all the others, you had the behind the podcast, and most excitingly for us in a sense, the behind the audiobook recording process in that. Amazing. You had Nanette, obviously, the behind the scenes backstage, how her show got created. Amazing. You had Edward Enninful's what goes on behind getting a magazine put out there. A really industry insight thing there. Then you had both of these two talking about, specific shows and movies and the behind the scenes there. So, not something I would have necessarily known we would get from this shortlist, but I think for basically everyone, I've said how I've enjoyed the getting that industry insight, getting some behind the scenes, and it's cool that we've had that across all of them.
That's great. So, thank you for listening, everyone. Please do check out all the books on the shortlist. I think they're all probably worth checking out, even if a title doesn't seem the sort of thing that you'd be into. I think it's still worth listening to. Yeah,
I also specifically wanted to acknowledge the fact that The Island of Missing Trees is nominated for the Page Turner category, and I'd recommend you listen to that in audio. I absolutely loved it. Go back and listen to our episode. Maybe listen to the book first. We tried to be not spoilery, but there's maybe a few things in there where it'd be better if you've listened to it to enjoy our conversation. And, I don't care about the spoiler to say that we both loved it. I especially really love this audiobook. I can't stop going on about it. So I would say go and listen to that. And it's not shortlisted in an audiobook category, but all of the nominations, if they have audio format, then there's no reason why you can't enjoy that. It's just these ones have been specifically selected as being the best of the non-fiction audio. So definitely check them out in whichever format you want to, but a specific shout out to The Island of Missing Trees, and specifically to that in audio, because I loved it.
Okay, so the winners of the British Book Awards will be announced on Monday the 15th of May. You can tune in on the British Book Awards website to kind of see the live announcements and the recipients receiving their rewards. This is going to be our last episode. For a while, we're taking a bit of a break because it's just been a bit of a push to get all these, listening to all these audiobooks. When we come back, we're going to be launching a Patreon, so please keep an eye out for the details of that. If you can please continue supporting the podcast, either by leaving a rating or review wherever you've listened to us, that really helps us get discovered. Following us on social media at AudiobookishPod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and we're also on TikTok now as well, I think. And if you want to get in touch with any recommendations or comments, you can email us at audiobookishpod@gmail.com. Thanks, Poppy. Any closing thoughts?
No, that's all good. Thanks for joining us for this. And yeah, enjoy the award ceremony.
Thanks, guys. See you later. Bye.
Bye.